She was 18 and homeless. No family, no plan, just a worn whittling knife and $3 silver to her name. And with that $3, she bought a worthless, abandoned silver mine in the Garnet Range of Montana. But what nobody knew was that sealed deep inside the foundation of its ruined cabin was something that would change her life and the quiet mountain town forever. For more stories of found hope in forgotten places, subscribe to our channel. Elspeth Thorne was born in the autumn of 1888, in a valley of the Bitterroot that was more shadow than sun. Her parents, Jonathan and Mary Thorne, were people of rigid expectations and silent disappointments. Jonathan was a farmer who saw land as a ledger of profit and loss, and Mary was a woman who had long ago packed her dreams into a small trunk in the attic and turned the key. They had wanted a son to work the farm, and in Elspeth, they saw only a future expense, another dowry to be paid. She grew up in the quiet spaces of their farmhouse, learning early that her presence was a thing to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Her world was one of chores done without comment and meals eaten without conversation. But on the far edge of the property, in a small cabin he had built himself with lodgepole pine and river stone, lived her grandfather, Angus Thorne. Angus was a widower, a carpenter by trade and a naturalist by soul, and he was the only person who ever saw the girl for who she was. He was a man of few words, but his hands were a language she understood perfectly. From the time she was 6, he would let her sit on a stool in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and linseed oil. He never spoke down to her. He taught her the names of the tools, not as if she were a child, but as if she were an apprentice. This was a ripsaw, for cutting with the grain. This, a crosscut. This was a smoothing plane, and you had to set the blade just so, a hair's breadth, to get a shaving so thin you could read a newspaper through it. He showed her how to hold a hammer, not by choking up on the handle but by holding the end, letting the weight of the head do the work. He taught her the character of wood, the stubbornness of oak, the generosity of pine, the fine, tight grain of maple. He spoke of the world in terms of its construction, of how things fit together, of the honesty in a well-made joint. He taught her that work was not a punishment, but a kind of conversation with the world. When she was 10, he gave her a knife. It was small, a whittling knife with a blade of good Sheffield steel and a handle he had fashioned from a piece of staghorn, polished smooth by years of his own touch. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "A tool is an extension of your will," he'd said, one of the longest sentences she had ever heard him speak. "It can create or it can destroy. The choice is in the hand that holds it. Keep it sharp and keep it true." That knife became her constant companion. In the quiet hours, she would sit on the porch of his cabin and learn to carve, turning scraps of pine into small, intricate birds, each feather carefully delineated. Angus would watch her, a rare, soft smile touching the corners of his mouth, and he would nod, a gesture of approval that felt more valuable than any currency. He was the one who taught her to read the land, to know which berries were safe, how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to listen to the silence and understand its meaning. When Elspeth was 16, Angus passed away quietly in his sleep. Her parents had him buried in the small churchyard, and they sold his tools for a pittance to a traveling merchant. They boarded up his cabin. For Elspeth, it was as if the only light in her world had been extinguished. The farm became a prison of silence, the disapproval of her parents, a palpable weight in the air. She kept the knife hidden in her pocket, its smooth handle a connection to the only person who had ever truly loved her, the only one who had given her skills instead of demands. She was a capable young woman, with hands that knew how to work and a mind that knew how to observe. But in her own home, she was invisible, a ghost waiting for her life to begin. Her 18th birthday arrived with the first chill of September, the air crisp and clean with the promise of frost. There was no cake, no celebration. It was a day like any other, marked only by the quiet turning of the calendar page. 2 days later, she woke to find a valise, a small, worn leather case, sitting by her bedroom door. Inside was one change of clothes, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in wax paper, and a plain white envelope. Her name, Elspeth, was written on the front in her father's severe, angular script. She opened it. There was no letter, no word of farewell. There were only $3 heavy and cold in her palm. She walked downstairs. The house was unnaturally quiet. Her parents were standing by the front door, dressed in traveling clothes. A wagon was already loaded in the yard, piled high with trunks and furniture. Her father did not look at her. He stared out the window, his jaw set. "The farm is sold," he said to the glass. "We are moving back east to Philadelphia. Your mother has family there." Mary Thorne, her mother, finally turned, but her eyes were distant, focused on a point somewhere over Elspeth's shoulder. "A new life?" she murmured, as if reciting a line from a play. "A respectable life." There was no anger in their voices, no passion. It was an administrative act, a closing of a ledger. Elspeth was a final entry to be cleared. She did not cry. She did not plead or argue. The years of silence had taught her the futility of it. She had learned from her grandfather that some things, like the grain of wood, cannot be forced. You had to work with them or work around them. She looked at the two people who had given her life but had never given her a home, and she felt a strange, hollow peace. The long waiting was over. She simply nodded, a small, sharp movement of her head. She turned and walked back up the stairs to her room. She did not take the valise they had packed for her. Instead, she took her own small canvas satchel, the one she used for gathering herbs for her grandfather. Into it, she placed her spare dress, a small whetstone for her knife, and a tinderbox. She put the loaf of bread inside and slipped the $3 into the deep pocket of her skirt, where they settled against the familiar shape of the staghorn-handled knife. She walked back down the stairs and out the front door, not looking back. She did not watch them leave. She walked down the long dirt track that led away from the farm, her head held high, her shoulders straight. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was cold, but it felt clean, cleansing. She was 18 years old, with $3 and a knife, and the whole world of mountains and sky was laid out before her. She was not leaving a home. She was finally escaping a house. The cruelty was not in a shout or a blow, but in the quiet, calm finality of it, the transactional nature of their departure. They had calculated her worth, and it was $3. She reached the end of the lane and turned north, towards the high country, towards the jagged peaks that had always seemed to her like a promise of something more. She did not know where she was going, but for the first time in her life, she felt she was walking in the right direction. The road north was a ribbon of dust that unspooled through valleys of golden aspen and climbed into passes thick with the scent of pine and cold stone. Elspeth walked with a steady, unhurried pace, a rhythm she had learned from long walks with her grandfather. She measured her days by the sun and her progress by the changing landscape. The gentle farmlands of the Bitterroot gave way to the rougher, more demanding terrain of the mountains. She moved through the world with a quiet watchfulness, her senses alive to the details her parents had never noticed. She saw the way the wind combed the tall grasses on the hillsides, the intricate lace of frost on a fallen leaf, the purposeful flight of a hawk circling on an updraft. The physical world was her catechism, its lessons plain and true. She ate the bread sparingly, supplementing it with late-season berries she knew were safe and the small, sweet roots of wild carrots she dug with the tip of her knife. She drank from clear, fast-running creeks, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. At night, she sought shelter in the lee of rock outcroppings or in the dry, fragrant haylofts of abandoned barns. She was alone, but she was not lonely. The silence of the wilderness was a comforting presence, a vast and patient companion, so different from the hostile silence of her parents' house. She felt the weight of their judgment lifting from her with every mile she put between herself and that valley. After 10 days of walking, she crested a high pass and looked down into a new valley. A small town was nestled beside a creek, a scattering of weathered wooden buildings huddled together, as if for warmth against the immense backdrop of the mountains. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, thin gray plumes against the sharp blue of the sky. This was Garnet Creek. It was a town that had seen better days. The paint on the storefronts was peeling, and many of the windows were boarded up. It had been a silver town, but the silver had played out, and most of the people had followed the money, leaving behind a skeleton crew of the stubborn and the hopeful. She walked down the main street, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. An old man sitting on a bench in front of a general store watched her pass, his eyes curious but not unkind. A woman shook a rug from an upstairs window, sending a cloud of dust into the autumn air. The town felt weary but not dead. It had the feeling of a place that was holding its breath, waiting. Elspeth felt no fear, only a deep and abiding curiosity. Her grandfather had taught her to look at a piece of wood and see the grain, to understand its strengths and weaknesses before making the first cut. She looked at this town in the same way. She saw the decay, but she also saw the strong bones of the buildings, the good stone foundations, the way the town was sited to catch the morning sun. She saw a place that had been built to last, even if the reason for its building was gone. She was tired, her boots worn, her dress dusty, but her spirit was intact. The journey had stripped away the last vestiges of the girl she had been and left behind the woman she was becoming, self-reliant, observant, and possessed of a quiet, unshakable endurance. She had not come here looking for charity or for a handout. She had come looking for a place to begin. Elspeth walked into the Garnet Creek General Store, the only establishment on the main street that seemed truly alive. The air inside was a rich tapestry of scents: coffee, cured leather, kerosene, and cinnamon. A man with a graying beard and wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm looking for the county claims office," Elspeth said, her voice clear and steady. The man raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That'd be me, part-time, postmaster and claims agent. Abernathy's the name." He gestured to a dusty corner of the store where a large, hand-drawn map was tacked to the wall, crisscrossed with lines and notations. "Looking to file?" "Looking to buy," she corrected him gently. "Something abandoned. Something nobody wants." "Mr." Abernathy studied her for a long moment, taking in the worn dress, the resolute set of her jaw, the canvas satchel over her shoulder. He saw not a beggar, but someone with a purpose. He grunted, a sound of reluctant respect, and walked over to the map. "Not much left that's worth a damn," he said, tapping a finger against the paper. "The big veins are played out. Most of these are just holes in the ground now. More trouble than they're worth." "That's what I'm looking for," she said. "Trouble that I can afford." His finger traced a line up into the mountains east of the town. It stopped on a small, faded square marked with a spidery script. "Here, the Sparrow's Hope. Patented by a fellow named Silas Croft 30 years ago. He worked it for a year, maybe 2, pulled out just enough to keep him in beans. Then the main adit collapsed in a winter storm. He walked away from it. Died a few years later, folks say." "What's there?" she asked. A hole in the ground, like I said. The foundation of a small cabin he built, mostly tumbled down. A rusted ore cart. The land's no good for grazing, too steep and rocky. Timber's mostly lodgepole, not worth much for milling. He looked at her again. What's it owed in back taxes? $3, he said, the words hanging in the air. Elspeth reached into her pocket. She laid the 3 heavy silver dollars on the worn wooden counter. They made a solid, definitive sound in the quiet store. Abernathy stared at the coins, then back at her face. He could have tried to dissuade her, could have told her a young woman had no business trying to scratch a living from a dead mine on the side of a mountain. But something in her eyes, a calm and serious light, stopped him. He saw the same stubborn grit that had settled this valley in the first place. He sighed, took a ledger from under the counter, and blew a layer of dust from its cover. He dipped a pen in an inkwell and began to write, his pen scratching across the page. Name? Elspeth Thorne. He recorded the transaction, his movements precise and official. He took a stamp, pressed it onto an ink pad, and brought it down with a firm thud on the page. He tore out the sheet and handed it to her. It was a deed, simple and direct, granting her title to the 10 acres of rock and pine that comprised the Sparrow's Hope claim. It's yours, he said, a note of wonder in his voice. Mountain and all. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her satchel. She bought a small sack of flour, a block of salt, and a handful of nails with the change from her bread money, her grandfather having taught her to always keep a small reserve. She thanked Mr. Abernathy and walked out of the store, the owner of a piece of the world. She followed the creek east out of town, then took a narrow, overgrown track that climbed steeply into the hills. After an hour's hard climb, she found it. It was exactly as he had described, and yet, to her, it was more. The mine entrance, the adit, was a dark slit in the mountainside, choked with a landslide of rock and earth. A few weathered timbers, cracked and gray, were all that remained of the entrance framing. Nearby were the ruins of the cabin, a low rectangle of dry stacked granite stones that formed a foundation about 12 feet by 16. The log walls were long gone, either burned for firewood or rotted back into the earth. A single tall stone chimney stood at one end, a lonely sentinel against the sky. An ore cart lay on its side, its wheels seized with rust. But Elspeth saw it with her grandfather's eyes. The foundation stones were solid, well chosen. The chimney was expertly built, its draw likely still true. The site was on a south-facing slope, sheltered from the north wind by a thick stand of pine, with a clear view down the valley. A small, year-round spring trickled from a rock face 100 yards away. Silas Croft had known what he was doing. He had chosen his spot well. This was not a ruin. It was a beginning. Elspeth's first priority was not the mine, but shelter. Winter in the Garnet Range was a serious and unforgiving affair, and it was already late in the season. The collapsed adit held no interest for her. She was a builder, not a miner. The stone foundation of the old cabin, however, was a gift. It was a solid, level base on which to build. Her plan was simple, to construct a small, tight cabin before the first heavy snows fell. But first, she had to clear the site. The interior of the foundation was filled with rubble, fallen stones from the chimney, rotten wood, and decades of accumulated earth and pine needles. She began the slow, arduous work of clearing it by hand. She used a flattened piece of rusted metal from the ore cart as a makeshift shovel, scooping the debris into a bucket and carrying it away. For 3 days, she worked from sunup to sundown, her muscles aching, her hands raw. It was patient, repetitive labor. But with each bucket of dirt she removed, she felt a deeper connection to the place, as if she were clearing away not just debris, but time itself, preparing the ground for a new future. On the fourth day, as she was clearing the area around the hearth, her makeshift shovel struck something that was not rock. It made a dull, metallic sound. Curious, she knelt and dug away the dirt with her bare hands. She uncovered the edge of a large, flat flagstone that formed the base of the hearth. It was a different type of stone from the others, a piece of dark, smooth slate, while the rest were rough granite. She remembered her grandfather telling her to always look for the thing that is different, the break in the pattern. She examined the edges. The mortar was different, too, a lighter color, and it seemed less weathered. It had been set in place more recently than the rest of the foundation. A thrill, not of fear but of pure, focused curiosity, ran through her. She spent the rest of the afternoon searching the area for a tool. She found what she was looking for near the collapsed mine. A long iron pry bar, once used for breaking rock, heavy and rusted, but still strong. She carried it back to the foundation. Working the tip of the pry bar into the thin seam around the slate, she put her full weight into it. The old mortar groaned and cracked. Slowly, painstakingly, she worked her way around the stone. Finally, with a great sucking sound of released pressure, the slate shifted. She levered it up and pushed it aside. Beneath it was not earth, but a small, dark cavity, a void in the foundation. It was lined with sheets of tin, carefully folded and sealed with pitch to keep out the moisture. A small, man-made chamber, hidden from the world. Her heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm in her chest. Reaching into the darkness, her fingers brushed against rough canvas. She pulled it out. It was a canvas sack, surprisingly heavy, and it clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Beside it was a small, leather-bound book, its cover stiff with age, and underneath that, a single object, cool and smooth to the touch. She lifted it into the light. It was a piece of rose quartz, worn and polished into the shape of a simple heart, its pinkish hue glowing in the late afternoon sun. She sat back on her heels, the three objects laid out before her on the grass. She opened the canvas sack first. It was filled with coins, stacked in neat rolls. Most were Morgan silver dollars, but there were also a number of $20 gold eagles, their surfaces bright and clean as the day they were minted. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined. Then she picked up the book. It was a journal. She opened it to the last entry, written in a clear, steady hand. The ink was faded, but perfectly legible. October 12th, 1858. The north wall has come down. The main timbers shattered like matchsticks. I am trapped. The air is good for now, but I know the way out is blocked by 1,000 tons of rock. I am not a fool. I will not see the sun again. My only regret is that I will not see my Eleanor's face again. I struck a small but rich vein of gold this last week. A pocket load. It is God's strange and bitter joke that I should find my fortune on the day I lose my life. I have sealed it, all of it, in the foundation of our cabin. I also leave this stone, the quartz heart I was polishing for her. It is the color of the mountains at sunrise, which she so loved. The writing paused, then resumed, a little less steady. To whoever finds this, my name is Silas Croft. I built this place with my own hands, for a life that was not to be. Do not let this money be a curse. Do not let it sit in the dark. Use it to build. Use it to make a home. Buy good tools and build something that will stand against the wind. Do not let the mountain have the last word. Live a life for me and for my Eleanor. Elspeth read the words again, her throat tight. She looked at the coins, the journal, the stone heart. This was not a treasure. It was a legacy, a trust. A hope passed from a stranger in the dark to a stranger in the light. She closed the journal and held the quartz heart in her palm. It was still warm from the last rays of the sun. She looked around at the ruined foundation, at the silent, waiting mountains. She was not just building a shelter anymore. She was answering a promise. With the first light of morning, Elspeth walked back down to Garnet Creek. She did not carry herself like a woman who had stumbled into a fortune, but with the quiet purpose of one who had been given a solemn task. She walked into Abernathy's general store, the small bell over the door announcing her arrival. Mr. Abernathy looked up, a question in his eyes. She did not speak of the money. She spoke of work. "I need supplies," she said, and laid a single $20 gold eagle on the counter. The coin shone like a small sun in the dim light of the store. Abernathy's eyes widened, but he asked no questions. He recognized the look on her face. It was the look of a homesteader, not a prospector. For the next hour, Elspeth moved through the store, selecting what she needed with the discerning eye her grandfather had taught her. She bought a good felling axe with a hickory handle, a buck saw with a sharp new blade, a set of wood chisels, a brace and bit, a draw knife, and a broadaxe for hewing logs. She bought kegs of nails, both cut and wire, sacks of flour, beans, and salted pork, coffee, sugar, and a cast-iron stove with a long stovepipe. She bought window glass and lamp oil, wool blankets, and a heavy tin kettle. It was a list born of knowledge, not of whim. As Mr. Abernathy tallied the cost, an old man who had been sitting by the stove got to his feet and came over. He was tall and stooped, with hands like gnarled oak roots. "That's a lot of gear for one person," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You planning on building?" "I am," Elspeth replied. "You'll need help raising the ridgepole," the man stated. "My name is Jedediah Stone. Used to be the smithy here, before the silver ran out. I've got a forge that still works." Elspeth looked at his hands, at the ingrained soot and the powerful set of his forearms. "I found an old pry bar," she said. "The tip is blunted." "Bring it to me," Jedediah said. "I'll give it a new temper." That afternoon, as Abernathy's boy delivered her supplies by mule back to the claim, Elspeth began her work in earnest. She selected her trees with care, straight, tall, lodgepole pines, felling them with the clean, swinging rhythm of her new axe. She notched them and dragged them to the site, stripping the bark with the draw knife, the pale, fragrant wood gleaming in the sun. She spent a week felling and preparing the logs. During that time, Jedediah Stone appeared at her claim, true to his word. He had not only retempered her pry bar, but had also forged a set of strap hinges and a latch for her future door from scrap iron. He watched her work for a while, her cuts straight and true. "You know your way around an axe," he said, a high compliment from a man of his generation. He stayed for an hour, showing her how to better use the broadaxe to hew a flat surface on the logs for the interior walls. He did not offer charity. He offered knowledge, a gift of craft from one worker to another. Soon after, another visitor arrived, a stout, kind-faced woman in her 50s, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "I'm Martha Gable," she said. "My husband runs the bakery. Mr. Abernathy said you were building up here. I thought you might be tired of beans." She uncovered the basket to reveal a fresh loaf of sourdough bread, a crock of butter, and a hot beef stew in a sealed pot. Elspeth, who had indeed been living on beans and salted pork, felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sun. She thanked Martha, who simply smiled. "A body needs fuel to do good work," she said, and left as quietly as she had come. The walls began to rise, log by careful log. Elspeth cut the saddle notches with her chisel and saw, fitting each log snugly onto the one below. The cabin took shape, a testament to Silas Croft's well-laid foundation and her own patient labor. When it came time to set the heavy ridgepole, the main beam that would support the roof, she knew she could not do it alone. As if on cue, a young man appeared on the trail, leading a mule. He was perhaps a few years older than her, with clear eyes and a quiet demeanor. "Name's Liam," he said. "Mr. Abernathy sent me. Said you might need a hand with the heavy lifting." Together, he and Jedediah, who had returned for the occasion, helped her rig a simple pulley and hoist the massive log into place. The three of them worked in a comfortable, efficient silence, each knowing their part. The community was not forming through words or declarations, but through the shared, practical language of work. A reforged tool, a hot meal, a strong back. These were the things that built a home and a town. The first snows came in late November, not the heavy burying snows of deep winter, but a light dusting that outlined every branch and rock in white. By then, Elspeth's cabin was complete. It stood small and solid on its stone foundation, the new pine logs already starting to weather to a soft silver gray. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin, steady plume that spoke of warmth and life within. The roof was pitched steeply, sheathed in hand-split cedar shakes she had traded for with Liam, whose father owned a small, abandoned shingle mill. The single window, facing south to catch the winter sun, was glazed and tight. The door, hung on Jedediah's black iron hinges, shut with a satisfying thud against the frame. Inside, the cabin was a single room, but it felt spacious and peaceful. The cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a deep, steady heat, and the air smelled of burning pine and brewing coffee. She had built her own furniture from the leftover lumber: a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bed frame piled high with wool blankets, and a set of shelves on the wall. The interior walls, which she had hewn flat, were smooth to the touch. It was a simple space, but everything in it was honest and well-made. She was no longer a stranger on the mountain. In her trips to town for supplies, people in Garnet Creek would nod to her, calling her by name. "Morning, Elspeth." "Looks like we're in for some weather, Miss Thorne." She had become part of the town's quiet fabric. Mr. Abernathy set aside her mail for her. Martha Gable always had an extra loaf of bread for her on baking days. Jedediah would stop by on his walks to check on her chimney's draw, and Liam would occasionally leave a brace of rabbits on her doorstep, a silent offering from his traplines. She found her own way to contribute. With the staghorn-handled knife her grandfather had given her, she began to carve again. She carved small, intricate figures of the animals she saw around her cabin: a hawk with its wings outstretched, a deer listening to the wind, a bear rising on its hind legs. The carvings were full of life and character. She brought a few to Mr. Abernathy, who set them on his counter. They sold within a day. Soon she had a steady trade, her small carvings becoming a prized commodity in the valley, a way for her to earn her keep and participate in the town's small economy, independent of Silas Croft's legacy. Her days settled into a peaceful rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the simple needs of her life. In the mornings, she would drink coffee by her window, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks, turning the snow-covered world pink and gold. She would spend her days chopping wood, checking her small snares, and working on her carvings. In the evenings, she would sit by the fire, the only light in the cabin coming from the flames and a single kerosene lamp. She would read books she bought from Abernathy, or simply sit with her own thoughts. The deep silence of the mountain, a comforting blanket around her. The property was transformed. What had been a forgotten ruin, a symbol of failure and loss, was now a homestead. The Sparrow's Hope, a name that once seemed ironic, now felt fitting. It was a place of refuge, a small pocket of warmth and life wrested from the cold indifference of the mountain. It was not just a shelter, it was a home, built not only of logs and stone, but of resilience, kindness, and the fulfillment of a long dormant promise. One evening in the heart of winter, with a blizzard howling outside and the snow piling in deep drifts against the cabin walls, Elspeth sat by her fire. The little stove glowed red, and the room was filled with a profound and peaceful warmth. The wind rattled the window pane, but inside, all was still and safe. On the simple mantelpiece she had built above the hearth, two objects sat side by side. On the left was the whittling knife her grandfather had given her, its staghorn handle worn to a deep, smooth patina by her own hand and his. On the right was the rose quartz heart left by Silas Croft, its polished surface catching the firelight and glowing with a soft, internal warmth. She looked at the two objects, a tool of creation and a symbol of love, and thought of the men who had given them to her. They were the three pillars of her life: her father, her grandfather, and the stranger who had died in the dark belly of the mountain. Her father, Jonathan, had given her a life she had to escape. His coldness and dismissal had been a kind of crucible, forcing upon her a self-reliance she might never have otherwise known. He had cast her out with $3 silver, intending it as a final insult, a severing. But in his cruelty, he had inadvertently given her the key to her own freedom. Her grandfather, Angus, had given her the skills to use that freedom. He had not given her money or praise, but something far more valuable: knowledge. He had taught her the language of wood and stone, the grammar of a well-struck nail and a true-cut line. He had armed her not with weapons, but with competence. In his quiet workshop, he had built the foundations of the woman she would become, a woman who could look at a ruin and see a home, a woman who could stand alone against the wind because she knew how to build a wall to break it. And then there was Silas Croft, a man she had never met, yet knew so intimately through his last words and the legacy he had left behind. He was a ghost and a benefactor, a man whose love for his own Eleanor had reached across 3 decades of silence to give Elspeth a future. His loss had become her beginning. His final desperate hope, scrawled in a journal in the fading light of a dying lamp, had been answered. She had taken his money and his charge seriously. She had bought good tools. She had built something that would stand. She had not let the mountain have the last word. The fire crackled, and she picked up the staghorn knife, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. Her life was a thing she had built, like the cabin around her. Her father had provided the worthless land. Her grandfather had provided the design, and Silas Croft had provided the materials. She had been the carpenter of her own existence. The wind howled, a lonely sound, but it was the sound of the world outside, not inside. The quiet life she now lived was richer and more real than anything she had ever known in her father's house. She was no longer waiting for her life to begin. She was living it, day by quiet, deliberate day. Elspeth Thorne was 18 and had been homeless. She had $3 to her name, and she spent it on a forgotten piece of mountain. It was the best $3 she ever spent. If her story of resilience and hidden hope moved you, a story of how a life can be built from what others have abandoned, consider subscribing for more tales of forgotten places and the quiet lives that inhabit them. Elspeth's journey reminds us that inheritance is not always a matter of bloodline or legal documents. Sometimes the most powerful legacies are left by strangers, sealed in stone and waiting for the right person to come along. Silas Croft's gift was not simply money. It was a charge, a transmission of hope from one generation to the next. He could not build the life he dreamed of with his Eleanor, so he left the tools and the means for someone else to build their own. His final act was one of profound faith in a future he would never see, in a person he would never know. This is a quieter kind of history, written not in grand monuments but in the sturdy walls of a small cabin, in the careful placement of a hearthstone, in a tool passed from one hand to another. It speaks to the idea that the world is full of these hidden pockets of grace, remnants of love and labor that persist long after their creators are gone. Elspeth's own strength was her ability to see the value where no one else did. Others saw a collapsed mine and a worthless plot of land. She saw a solid foundation and a place to make a stand. Her grandfather had trained her eyes to see the potential in raw materials. and she applied that lesson not just to wood, but to her own life. She did not curse her father for what he took away, but instead used the meager thing he gave her to find something lasting. Her story is a testament to the power of quiet competence, of patient work, and of the community that forms not through grand pronouncements, but through small, practical acts of kindness. A reforged tool, a loaf of warm bread, a helping hand with a heavy beam. It is a reminder that we are all, in some way, builders, and the foundations we lay, both for ourselves and for others, can last longer than we know. What forgotten corner of your own world? What abandoned project or neglected relationship might hold a hidden value, waiting only for a patient hand and a hopeful heart to uncover it?